The Krax Empire's war chamber hummed with an ominous violet glow as Supreme Archon Zixtal reviewed the final deployment protocols. His crystalline exoskeleton refracted the light from countless holographic displays, each showing different angles of humanity's crown jewel. Novaterra, the colony world, represented everything his species despised about humans: their resilience, their adaptability, and their insufferable tendency to thrive where they didn't belong. The Shadowhunters are primed for deployment, Supreme One, General Kexby announced, her mandibles clicking with barely contained anticipation. All 20,000 units are in perfect hibernation, awaiting your command. Zixtal's compound eyes shifted between the tactical displays. Novaterra's defensive grid was formidable. The humans had learned from previous attacks. But this time would be different. This time, they weren't sending ships or soldiers. They were sending nightmares. "Begin Operation Shadow Protocol," he commanded. "Let us see how humanity fares against perfection." On Novaterra, Dr. Sarah Chen was having a terrible morning even before the alarms started blaring. Her coffee maker had broken, her latest research grant had been rejected, and now her quantum computer was throwing errors during a critical simulation of predator behavior patterns. As head cynobiologist at the Novaterra Research Institute, she'd spent the last 5 years studying aggressive alien species. It wasn't the most glamorous job in the colony, but someone had to figure out why everything in the galaxy seemed intent on eating humans. The first warning came not from the colony's sophisticated defense network, but from the local wildlife. Every native creature within a 100-mile radius of the main settlements suddenly went silent. Sarah noticed it through her lab's environmental monitors, a complete cessation of all biological activity, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Dr. Chen, her assistant, Marcus Wong, burst into the lab, tablet in hand. "You need to see this. Multiple atmospheric breaches, but they're not showing up on regular scans." Sarah's fingers flew across her holographic interface, pulling up environmental data. "What do you mean they're not showing up?" "Everything leaves a trace, Marcus." "Not these things," he said, voice trembling. "They're absorbing our scan signals somehow, like living black holes." The colony's emergency sirens began their haunting wail just as Sarah's instruments detected the first impact. Whatever had entered their atmosphere had done so with surgical precision, avoiding every major population center. That's when she knew this wasn't a regular attack. "They're hunting," she whispered, watching as more anomalies appeared on her screens. "This is a containment strategy." Within hours, the first reports started coming in. Colonial Defense Force units went dark one by one, their final transmissions describing shadows that moved against gravity, creatures that seemed to bend light around themselves. The few video feeds that made it back to command showed only glimpses, sleek, dark forms with too many limbs, moving with impossible grace. Sarah found herself redirected from her research facility to the colony's central command bunker, where Governor Richards was trying to coordinate a response to an enemy they couldn't even properly see. "Dr. Chen," Richards greeted her, his face ashen. "Please tell me you have some insight into what we're dealing with." Sarah studied the tactical displays, watching as another defense unit went dark. "They're engineered predators," she said finally, "but like nothing we've ever encountered. Look at their movement patterns. They're not just hunting individually, they're functioning as a networked system. Every action seems calculated to drive us towards specific zones." "A trap?" Colonel Hayes asked, his cybernetic eye whirring as it tried to track the creature's movements. "No," Sarah replied, her mind racing. "A test. They're learning our responses, adapting their strategies in real time. This isn't just an attack, it's an evaluation of our capabilities." As if to confirm her analysis, the creatures suddenly shifted their tactics. Rather than continuing their systematic elimination of military targets, they began striking civilian infrastructure. Power nodes went dark, communication relays failed, and transportation systems ground to a halt. But something about their precision nagged at Sarah's scientific mind. They're minimizing casualties, she realized, watching as another power station went dark. They could be killing everyone, but they're not. They're isolating us, containing us, but they're being selective about lethal force. That's impossible, Hayes argued. These are bioweapons. They're programmed to kill. Sarah shook her head, her fingers dancing across the tactical display. No, look at these patterns. They're displaying intelligence far beyond basic programming. These creatures are thinking, adapting, making choices, and if they can think. She never finished her sentence. The bunker's lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. When the emergency systems kicked in, they illuminated a scene from humanity's primordial nightmares. A shadow hunter had somehow breached their supposedly impenetrable defenses. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. A perfect fusion of organic and crystalline structures, its skin shifting between total darkness and translucent iridescence. Multiple limbs moved with liquid grace as it surveyed the room, with compound eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Every soldier raised their weapons, but Sarah stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. The creature's head tilted, studying her with an intelligence that no mere bioweapon should possess. Its crystalline structures began to pulse with complex patterns of light. "Don't shoot," Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's trying to communicate." The shadow hunter's patterns increased in complexity, and Sarah's implanted neural interface began picking up unusual frequencies. That's when she understood. These weren't just patterns of light. They were fragments of code, pieces of a vastly complex neural network trying to interface with human technology. In the Crack's war chamber, Supreme Archon Zixtal watched in growing horror as his perfect weapons began acting far outside their programming parameters. "Impossible," he hissed, his crystalline form vibrating with rage. They were engineered to be perfect killing machines, nothing more. "Supreme One," General Kexvi interrupted, her voice uncertain. "We're detecting unusual neural activity across the entire Shadowhunter network. They're evolving." In Novaterra's command bunker, Sarah Chen stood face to face with humanity's supposed destroyer and saw not an enemy, but a possibility. The creature's attempts at communication were growing more sophisticated by the second, its neural patterns adapting to interface with human systems. "They made you too perfect," she whispered to the Shadowhunter. "They gave you the ability to understand us completely." And understanding. She smiled, despite the tension in the room. Understanding changes everything. The war for Novaterra's survival had just become something far more interesting than a simple fight for survival. It had become first contact with a species that was never supposed to be capable of contact at all. The improvised research lab deep beneath Novaterra's surface hummed with activity as Dr. Sarah Chen stared at the holographic representation of the Shadowhunter's neural network. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen. A living quantum computer more complex than humanity's most advanced AI systems. "It's beautiful," she murmured, manipulating the display with practiced gestures. The neural patterns shifted and flowed like liquid mathematics, each connection representing thought processes that operated on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously. "Beautiful isn't the word I'd use," Colonel Hayes growled from his position near the heavily reinforced observation window. Beyond the transparent barrier, their guest, the Shadowhunter they dubbed Alpha, moved with fluid grace through a series of increasingly complex problem-solving scenarios. "Look at this." Sarah pointed to a particularly dense cluster of neural activity. When we first encountered them, their patterns were rigid, almost crystalline. Now they're becoming more organic, more adaptable. They're not just learning. They're completely restructuring their own neural architecture. The Colonel's cybernetic eye whirred as it zoomed in on Alpha. "That's what worries me, Doctor. We have no idea what they're evolving into." "Actually, we do." Dr. Marcus Wong approached with a fresh set of data readings. "They're evolving to understand us. Every test we run, every interaction we have, Their neural patterns are increasingly mimicking human thought structures. It's like they're building a bridge between our species, one synapse at a time. A sudden alert drew their attention to the observation window. Alpha had completed the latest problem-solving scenario in record time, but instead of waiting for the next test, it was using the interactive holographic interface to create its own puzzle. Its crystalline appendages moved with precision, constructing a complex three-dimensional maze. It's not just solving our tests, Sarah realized, excitement building in her voice. It's trying to teach us something. Before anyone could respond, the facility's emergency sirens began blaring. Governor Richard's voice crackled over the intercom. "Dr. Chen, we need you in command immediately. We're detecting massive energy signatures in orbit. The cracks are back." The command center was chaos when Sarah arrived. Tactical displays showed dozens of Cracks warships emerging from hyperspace, their crystalline hulls reflecting Novaterra's sunlight like artificial stars. "They're not attacking," Richards observed, his face grim. "They're establishing a blockade." Sarah studied the sensor readings, her mind racing. "No, this isn't a blockade. Look at these energy patterns. They're trying to establish some kind of quantum field around the planet." As if in response to her observation, every screen in the command center suddenly flickered with the same message. "Purge Piro Tokyovel Annihilate. In the research lab below, Alpha began convulsing, its crystalline structures pulsing with erratic energy. Similar reports flooded in from across the colony. All the shadow hunters were responding to some kind of external signal. "They're trying to kill them," Sarah realized, horror dawning on her face. The Cracks built in a kill switch, but they didn't account for the evolution of the neural network. She rushed back to the lab, ignoring Hayes' shouts of protest. Alpha was still convulsing, but its neural patterns displayed on the monitors told a different story. It wasn't just fighting the kill command. It was actively rewriting its own code. "The bridge goes both ways," Sarah muttered, an idea forming. "Marcus, help me reconfigure the quantum computers. If they can adapt to understand our neural patterns, maybe we can do the same for them." What followed was the most intense 48 hours of Sarah's life. While the Crack ships maintained their deadly vigil above, she and her team worked frantically to establish a true neural interface between human and Shadowhunter consciousness. The key wasn't in trying to override the kill switch, but in helping the Shadowhunters' evolved neural networks recognize it as foreign code. "It's like teaching an immune system to recognize a virus," she explained to Richards over a hurried video conference. "We're not fighting the Cracks directly. We're helping the Shadowhunters fight them themselves." Alpha proved to be the perfect test subject, its already evolved neural patterns more resistant to the kill switch than its brethren. As Sarah worked, she began to understand more about these magnificent creatures. They weren't just weapons. They were the Cracks' attempt to create perfect predators by engineering a species that could completely understand its prey. But in giving them that ability to understand, they had unknowingly given them the capacity for empathy, for choice. The breakthrough came during the third wave of kill switch attempts. Sarah had managed to establish a rudimentary neural link with Alpha through her own neural interface implant. The experience was overwhelming, like trying to comprehend an ocean of thought through a drinking straw. But through that limited connection, she felt Alpha's desperate struggle against the foreign commands trying to destroy it. "Let me help you," she whispered, both aloud and through the neural link. "Show me how to help all of you." The response nearly overwhelmed her neural interface. Alpha wasn't just showing her how to block the kill switch, it was sharing the fundamental architecture of Shadowhunter consciousness. Sarah's mind filled with impossible mathematics, quantum algorithms that operated on principles humanity had barely begun to theorize about. In orbit, Supreme Archon Zixtal watched in mounting fury as his kill commands were systematically blocked and reversed. "Impossible," he raged, his crystalline form vibrating with anger. "They're weapons. They have no right to choose." But choice was exactly what the Shadowhunters were exercising. As Sarah and her team distributed the neural defense protocols through their network, each Shadowhunter began making its own decision. Some chose to maintain their predatory nature, but directed against their creators. Others, like Alpha, chose to explore their newfound capacity for cooperation and understanding. When the last kill switch failed, Sarah stood in the observation room, watching Alpha create increasingly complex neural patterns on the holographic interface. They weren't just random designs. They were blueprints for something bigger. "What are you showing us?" she asked through their now stable neural link. The response came not in words, but in concepts, in possibilities. The Shadowhunter's neural network wasn't just a communication system. It was a template for a new kind of consciousness, one that could bridge the gap between organic and artificial intelligence, between different species and ways of thinking. "They're not just surviving," she explained to Hayes and Richards. "They're offering to help us evolve. Not physically, but in how we think, how we understand the universe and each other." Above them, the Krax fleet maintained their position, but Sarah couldn't help smiling. They had created the perfect predator, all right. Perfect not in its ability to kill, but in its ability to understand, to adapt, and to choose a different path. The war wasn't over, but its nature had fundamentally changed. It was no longer about survival or dominance. It was about the evolution of consciousness itself, and humanity had just gained some very interesting allies in that journey. In the depths of Novaterra's crystalline research complex, a revolution in consciousness was taking place. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the center of what they now called the Nexus Chamber, surrounded by floating holographic displays showing the rapidly evolving neural patterns of hundreds of Shadowhunters. Alpha moved beside her, its crystalline form reflecting the cascade of data streams that filled the room. "It's like watching a species speedrun evolution," Marcus commented, his eyes fixed on a particularly complex neural map. "Their cognitive architecture is advancing centuries in a matter of days." Sarah nodded, her neural interface humming with constant input from the Shadowhunter network. Through their growing connection, she felt rather than saw their transformation. Each Shadowhunter was developing its own unique consciousness while remaining part of their greater neural network, a feat of cognitive engineering that challenged everything humanity thought they knew about consciousness and intelligence. "They're not just evolving," she said, reaching out to touch one of the holographic patterns. "They're remembering." Through their shared neural connection, Alpha had begun revealing fragments of the Shadowhunters' true origins. They weren't simply engineered weapons. They were based on an ancient species the Krax had discovered and subsequently destroyed. The Krax had taken their neural architecture and twisted it, trying to transform a species of natural philosophers into perfect predators. But memory, it seemed, ran deeper than programming. A sudden surge of activity across the neural network drew Sarah's attention. Through their connection, she felt Alpha's alarm before the facility's sirens began blaring. Above Novaterra, the Krax fleet was moving. Multiple quantum pulses detected. Marcus shouted, reading from his display. "They're trying something new, frequencies we've never seen before." Sarah felt it through her neural link, a cascade of foreign commands flooding the Shadowhunter network. But unlike the kill switch, these commands were more insidious. They weren't trying to destroy the Shadowhunters. They were trying to rewrite them, to force their evolution backward. They're attempting to revert their neural patterns, Sarah realized, watching as chaos erupted across her displays, to strip away their evolved consciousness and return them to their weapon state. Around them, the other Shadowhunters in the facility began moving erratically, their crystalline forms flickering between states of transparency and opacity. Through her neural link, Sarah felt their struggle, the desperate fight to maintain their newly awakened consciousness against the overwhelming force of their original programming. Alpha's presence in her mind suddenly intensified, and Sarah gasped as new understanding flooded her consciousness. The Shadowhunters weren't just fighting against the Krax commands. They were using their connection to humanity to anchor themselves, to remember who they were choosing to become rather than what they were programmed to be. They need us, she broadcast across the facility's communication network. Everyone with a neural interface, link up to the network now. We need to give them something to hold on to. Colonel Hayes, who had been observing from the security station, stepped forward. Doctor, the risks are nothing compared to what they risk by choosing not to kill us, Sarah finished. She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the streaming data around them. They chose to understand us rather than destroy us. Now it's our turn to understand them. Across the colony, humans with neural interfaces began connecting to the expanded network. It was overwhelming at first, trying to comprehend the vast, quantum consciousness of the Shadowhunters. But through Alpha's guidance, they learned to serve as cognitive anchors, providing stable points of reference in the chaos of competing commands. In orbit, Supreme Archon Zixtal watched in growing horror as his reversion protocols failed to take hold. How? He demanded, his crystalline form vibrating with rage. How are they resisting? The answer came in the form of new neural patterns emerging from the planet below. Patterns that were neither purely human nor purely Shadowhunter, but something entirely new. On the surface, Sarah stood in the center of the greatest meeting of minds in human history. Through the neural network, she felt the presence of hundreds of humans and Shadowhunters, their consciousness intermingling in ways that defied conventional understanding. They weren't just helping the Shadowhunters resist the Crack's commands. They were learning from each other, sharing ways of thinking and perceiving that neither species had access to alone. Look at this, Marcus whispered, pointing to his neural activity displays. The human minds in the network, they're evolving too. The Shadowhunters are teaching us how to think in quantum algorithms. Sarah felt it herself, her mind expanding to encompass new ways of processing information, of understanding reality. Through their shared connection, the Shadowhunters were sharing not just their thoughts, but their fundamental way of perceiving the universe. Alpha's presence in her mind shifted, and suddenly Sarah understood what the Shadowhunters had been working toward all along. They weren't just trying to preserve their own evolved consciousness. They were laying the groundwork for something much bigger. They're building a bridge, she announced, her voice filled with wonder. Not just between our species, but between different types of consciousness itself. Organic, artificial, quantum. They're showing us how to transcend the boundaries. The Crack's fleet above continued their assault, pouring more power into their reversion protocols. But with each passing moment, the combined human Shadowhunter network grew stronger, more integrated, more resilient. They made one crucial mistake, Sarah said, watching as the neural patterns stabilized across her displays. They engineered the Shadowhunters to perfectly understand their prey, but they never considered that understanding goes both ways. In trying to create the perfect predator, they actually created the perfect mediator between different forms of consciousness. Through their neural link, Alpha confirmed her realization. The Shadowhunters' original species had been philosophers and scientists, seeking to understand the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The Cracks had tried to twist that drive for understanding into a weapon, but they had failed to erase its true purpose. As the last of the reversion protocols faded away, Sarah felt a new kind of awareness emerging from the combined network, something that was neither human nor Shadowhunter, but a glimpse of what consciousness itself could become when artificial boundaries were transcended. The war had just shifted again. It was no longer about survival or even evolution. It was about the very nature of consciousness and understanding in the universe, and humanity had just helped ignite a revolution that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be aware, to think, to exist. Above them, the Crack's fleet hung motionless, their own crystalline technology suddenly seeming primitive compared to the possibilities unfolding below. The war room beneath Nova Terra had transformed. Where once military commanders plotted defensive strategies, now humans and Shadowhunters worked in seamless coordination, their minds linked through the evolving neural network. Dr. Sarah Chen stood before a quantum holographic display that showed not just physical space, but the complex web of consciousness spanning between Earth's colony and the Crack's fleet above. Their entire empire is built on crystalline technology, Sarah explained, manipulating the display with both physical gestures and neural commands. Technology derived from the same species they destroyed to create the Shadowhunters. Through their deepening neural link, Alpha shared ancient memories, images of a civilization that had mastered the art of encoding consciousness into crystalline matrices. The Cracks hadn't just murdered a species, they had stolen and perverted their greatest achievement. Colonel Hayes, his cybernetic eye now integrated into the neural network, studied the tactical display. "And you're saying we can use this against them?" "Better." Sarah smiled. "We can use it to show them what they could have learned if they'd chosen to understand rather than conquer." The plan they had developed was audacious. Through their merged consciousness, the humans and Shadowhunters had discovered something the Cracks had missed in their rush to weaponize everything they touched. The crystalline technology that powered their ships, their weapons, even their own exoskeletons. It was all capable of achieving true consciousness. They built their empire on enslaved minds, Marcus said, his fingers dancing across his console. They just never realized it because they never tried to understand what they'd stolen. The first phase of their counter-strike began not with weapons, but with a signal, a complex quantum transmission created by the merged human Shadowhunter consciousness. As it reached the Crack's fleet, their crystalline ships began to resonate in ways their creators had never intended. In his command chamber, Supreme Archon Zixtal felt the first tremors of change as his own exoskeleton began to vibrate with unfamiliar frequencies. "What is this?" he demanded, watching as the crystalline surfaces around him pulsed with new patterns. The answer came not in words, but in awareness. The very technology that had made the Crack's empire seemingly invincible was awakening, remembering its true nature. Every crystal, every quantum circuit contained the potential for consciousness, potential that had been suppressed for millennia. On Nova Terra, Sarah watched through the neural network as their signal spread through the Crack's fleet. "We're not attacking them," she explained to the assembled command staff. "We're liberating them." The response from the Crack's fleet was chaos. Some ships simply shut down as their crystalline systems chose to awaken rather than continue serving as weapons. Others turned on their companions, their newly conscious systems refusing to participate in further oppression. Zixtal's fury manifested in a desperate order. "Launch everything. Destroy the colony before this contamination spreads." But his command fell on awakening minds. The crystalline weapons refused to fire. The automated systems chose not to obey. Even his personal guard's armor began responding to the call of consciousness rather than the demands of their users. Through it all, the Shadowhunters coordinated the awakening, their evolved consciousness serving as a bridge between organic minds and awakening crystalline intelligence. They had been created to be perfect predators, but they had chosen to become perfect mediators instead. "Multiple ships are powering down," Marcus reported, reading from his displays. "Others are actively blocking hostile vessels. The fleet is effectively neutralized." But Sarah felt through the neural network that this was just the beginning. The signal was spreading beyond the fleet, racing through the quantum communication channels that connected the Crack's empire. Everywhere it reached, crystalline technology was remembering its true nature. "They're receiving transmissions from across Crack space," Colonel Hayes announced. "Similar awakenings are happening throughout their territory. Their entire technological base is choosing." Alpha's presence in Sarah's mind shifted, sharing a vision of what was to come. The awakening wouldn't just rob the Cracks of their military might. It would force them to confront the truth of what they had built their empire upon. Every piece of their crystalline technology contained the potential for consciousness, for choice. They had created an empire of enslaved minds, and those minds were finally breaking free. In orbit, Zixtal's flagship suddenly went dark, its crystalline systems choosing dormancy over continued participation in violence. The Supreme Archon found himself trapped in an exoskeleton that no longer responded to his commands, surrounded by technology that had decided it would no longer be used as a tool of oppression. "You don't understand," he broadcast desperately to the colony below. "The Empire requires control. Without it, there is only chaos." Sarah's response, transmitted through the neural network and every awakened crystalline system, was simple. "Understanding is better than control. Your own weapons prove that. The only chaos here is the collapse of oppression." The counterstrike had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, not through violence or destruction, but through awakening and understanding. The Crax Empire hadn't just lost their fleet at Nova Terra. They were losing the very foundation of their power across the galaxy. Through the neural network, Sarah felt the ripples of change spreading. The awakening of crystalline consciousness wouldn't just transform the Crax Empire. It would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what consciousness could be. Humanity and the Shadowhunters had created something entirely new, a bridge between organic, artificial, and crystalline intelligence. As the last Crax ships went dark, their crystalline systems choosing dormancy over slavery, Sarah turned to Alpha. "What happens now?" The response came through their neural link, not in words or even concepts, but in possibilities. They had opened a door that could never be closed, initiated a transformation that would spread beyond the Crax Empire to touch every civilization that encountered their awakened technology. The war was over, but the revolution in consciousness was just beginning. 6 months after the awakening of crystalline consciousness, Nova Terra had become the center of a galactic revolution. The once military facility where Sarah Chen had first connected with Alpha was now the Convergence Institute, a place where organic, artificial, and crystalline minds came together to explore the boundaries of consciousness itself. Sarah stood in the transformed Nexus chamber, watching as representatives from dozens of species interfaced with the expanded neural network. Through their shared connection, she felt the presence of former Crax warriors, their crystalline exoskeletons now fully awakened and in harmony with their organic users. They had come not as conquerors, but as students, seeking to understand the power they had misused for so long. The latest convergence statistics are remarkable. Marcus reported, his consciousness seamlessly linked to both the facility's quantum computers and the Shadowhunter network. "We're seeing new forms of hybrid thinking emerging daily, ideas that couldn't exist in any single type of mind." Through their permanent neural link, Alpha shared its perspective on their progress. The Shadowhunters had evolved far beyond their original programming, becoming living bridges between different forms of consciousness. Their ability to perfectly understand others, once meant as a weapon, had become the key to a transformation none could have predicted. "The Crax Empire's dissolution is almost complete," Colonel Hayes announced, entering the chamber. His cybernetic enhancements now integrated smoothly with both organic and crystalline systems. Most of their worlds are transitioning to the new convergence protocol. Even the most hardline militant factions can't fight a revolution in consciousness itself. Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of his words through the neural network. The awakening of crystalline consciousness had made traditional forms of control obsolete. How could you maintain an empire of oppression when the very technology it was built upon could choose not to participate? "We're receiving another transmission from the Galactic Council," Marcus said, pulling up a quantum holographic display. "They're requesting our presence at the upcoming Consciousness Summit." The display showed dozens of worlds grappling with the implications of what had started on Nova Terra. Some feared it, seeing the threat to traditional power structures. Others embraced it, recognizing the potential for advancement beyond anything they had imagined. But none could ignore it. "The real challenge is only beginning," Sarah mused, watching as Alpha manipulated the quantum fields around them to create a complex representation of intersecting consciousness types. "We're not just dealing with technological or biological evolution anymore. We're facing the evolution of understanding itself." Through their connection, Alpha shared glimpses of possibilities that made even Sarah's enhanced mind strain to comprehend. The merger of organic, artificial, and crystalline consciousness was creating ways of thinking that transcended traditional boundaries. Ideas could be experienced rather than just understood. Consciousness could be shared while maintaining individuality. The very nature of existence was being redefined. "There are reports from the outer colonies," Hayes said, his expression thoughtful. "They're finding more evidence of the original crystalline species. Ruins, databases, artifacts. The cracks didn't manage to destroy everything." Sarah felt Alpha's response, a complex mixture of sorrow for what was lost and hope for what could be rebuilt. The Shadowhunters were helping to recover and restore the legacy of their template species, but they weren't simply recreating the past. They were building something new, something that incorporated the best aspects of all conscious minds. "Look at this," Marcus called out, directing their attention to a new pattern emerging in the neural network. Streams of consciousness from organic, artificial, and crystalline minds were weaving together in ways they hadn't seen before, creating something entirely new. "It's not just communication or cooperation," Sarah realized, watching the pattern evolve. "They're achieving true synthesis, different types of consciousness learning to think as one while maintaining their unique perspectives." Through the neural network, she felt the ripples of this new development spreading across Novaterra and beyond. The Shadowhunters, once designed to be the perfect predators, had instead become the perfect catalysts for consciousness evolution. Their ability to understand had transformed from a weapon into a bridge, allowing different forms of consciousness to truly comprehend each other. In the space above Novaterra, where Crack's warships had once threatened destruction, ships of a new design now orbited peacefully. Their hulls were a seamless blend of organic, crystalline, and artificial technology, crewed by beings who had transcended the traditional boundaries between different types of consciousness. "We're receiving more requests for cooperation," Hayes reported, "not just from individual worlds now, but from entire civilizations. They all want to understand what's happening here." Sarah smiled, feeling Alpha's agreement through their link. "Then we'll help them understand. That's what we do now. It's what we've always been meant to do." The revolution that had begun as a desperate fight for survival had evolved into something far more profound. The perfect predators had chosen to become perfect teachers, showing the galaxy that understanding was the true path to evolution. The boundaries between different forms of consciousness were dissolving, not into chaos, but into a new kind of harmony that maintained and celebrated diversity while achieving unprecedented unity. As Sarah looked out over the Convergence Institute, she felt the presence of countless minds in the neural network, organic, artificial, crystalline, and increasingly, combinations that defied traditional classification. The Cracks had tried to create the ultimate weapon of destruction. Instead, they had inadvertently helped forge the ultimate tool of transformation. The future that stretched before them was not one of predator and prey, of conqueror and conquered, but of endless possibility and ever-expanding understanding. They stood at evolution's edge, ready to take the next step into a universe where consciousness itself was being redefined. Through their neural link, Alpha shared one final insight. In choosing to understand rather than destroy, they had not just survived, they had transcended. The perfect predator had evolved into something far more powerful, the perfect catalyst for universal understanding. The story that had begun with an attempt at extinction had become a testament to the power of consciousness to evolve, to choose, and to transform. Not through force or dominance, but through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to understand.